Okay. I am going to call this lecture to order and get us underway because I know we have a limited amount of time and Dirk has a lot of material he'd like to cover today. First, I'd just like to thank everyone for coming to this. This is the penultimate IM public lecture of this academic year, so we do have one more upcoming. My name is Ryan Whalen. I'm a faculty member here in the School of Information Management. And before I allow Dirk to take the floor, I just wanted to say a few words of introduction and welcoming to him. It is difficult to cover the breadth and depth of Dirk's experience in just a few words, so I'm just going to hit a couple of highlights today. Dirk is a graduate of McGill University, from where he went on to teach air photo interpretation and environmental remote sensing at a variety of universities. He's currently a partner and geoscientist at Erde Environmental Research, and Dirk has worked with a variety of really interesting and high-profile institutions, including the German Aerospace Center, the Canadian RadarSat Project Office, the Canada Centre for Remote Sensing, Environmental Canada, the Canadian Space Agency, and the Defence Research Establishment. Dirk has also chaired the National Remote Sensing Working Group, and in 2010 he was appointed the director of the International Ocean Institute Canada Association. This afternoon, Dirk is going to discuss aerial surveying in his talk titled Setting the Sights on the Cities, Civilian Aerial Surveys in Canada During the Early 1920s. So please join me in welcoming Dirk to give today's lecture.
Thanks for coming out for this talk. My interest is in seeing the world from above. And this particular talk is one of four that I've researched on how Nova Scotia has been seen in the early days from the vantage point of above. It's a very, very auspicious one and much sought after vantage point. And for that reason, it has been sought by military people quite often. And it is not a coincidence that setting the sights on the city has a bit of a martial undertone to it. But as you see from this example, in our modern times, we use this vantage point in our surveying work quite a bit. But the focus of my talk today is on civilian aerial surveys in Canada during the early 1920s. And the story that I want to convey to you is really one of two convergences. The first one is of a more technical nature because it was the convergence of powered flight and photography. Now, in the 1920s, photography was around for almost a century, but powered flight was only around for a mere decade. So this convergence was a very, very important one to make sure that one could acquire geospatial information, as we would put it now, from above in a systematic way, in a repeatable way, and in a scalable way. Very important points. The second convergence I will talk about a little later. That is non-technical, it's more of an institutional nature. I will focus and give you as a prime example of the early surveys the 1921 air photo mission of Halifax. This is 1923, oblique photograph of the Halifax Peninsula. The survey itself was taken from above with vertical aerial photographs, and I will introduce them to you a little later. But let me come to the first convergence, that of flight and photography. Flight in 1905 was not an assured thing, as you can see from this particular photo. Yet, Alberto Santos Dumont, who was a contemporary of the Wright brothers, and they were head-to-head on getting airborne, didn't wait. He worked for another year until his plane, this particular one, 14 bis, was actually airborne and flew some several hundred meters at a fairly low altitude. But he managed to get airborne with his motor and without donkey at that time to take flight. And it only took another decade for flight and aerial reconnaissance to take this shape. This is a photograph taken during the First World War, where American pilots and an observer with an air photo camera are preparing for a mission during the war. It is during the First World War that aerial photography really, really took off. And to give you a sense of how this information, this intelligence, image intelligence, was collected, I have a graph here that shows you how the aerial reconnaissance squadrons were attached to each division, and each division had its own sector, and each sector of the entire front, Western Front, was covered repeatedly and quite often by aerial photographs. Here is sort of what looks like a hodgepodge and very confusing map representation of the front. It probably represented the confusion at times quite a bit. But you see in red the French first positions, then the no man's land, and then the German positions in blue, and then the divisions in the horizontal, in the vertical lines between the various divisions and their artillery positions here and way up there. And I enhance now the kind of photography that was acquired at the time. It was not very systematic, as you would see, but it was guided by a dash to a destination, and then they beat a track back because they were being attacked by German fighters. But this, in essence, was what the aerial reconnaissance was about, to acquire aerial photography repeatedly over the same area, vertically, so that the photography could be compared to next week's, to next month's data acquisition. And the resulting maps, photo maps, if you wish, then looked like this, where you had the French or British or the American trenches here, no man's land here, and the German trench system over here. Displayed here against the background of a conventional map, but these conventional maps were outdated so quickly, and hence the need for frequent aerial photography. You don't see much of humans in those pictures because they were too high up, but it has a very, very important component, and it was actually a component that got me into this when I tried to research my grandfather's participation in that particular sector. And I had of him this photo where he, as a very young fellow, 20 years old, was in the trenches there, and there was the signage here and here and here that I could decipher, and I knew in which area it was, and I made it to these maps in the Kew archives and written to pretty accurately nail down where these guys were stationed at the time. Now, to give you an idea of the value of the photography, have a look at this map of Passchendaele, heavily fought over during the Third Battle of Ypres in 1917, in a regular map rendition that included these occasional trench outlines here during 17. Prior to that, was this aerial photograph that was taken of this rather peaceful little village in Flanders before all hell broke loose. And here is the scene of Passchendaele after the battle was fought. The entire landscape is pockmarked by artillery shells, craters. And most of these craters were filled with water because it was raining so frequently during the battle that, you know, all these craters filled up with water. Here you see in this ground photo how difficult it is to get an orientation, whereas the air photo gave you a very, very good orientation. 8 soldiers are here in this image. 7 survived. This one here, whoops. Just a second. One fellow here, he survived the ordeal. I should say that aerial photography was taken by the French, by the Americans, by the British, and by the Germans. So everybody was into the act, and an enormous amount was collected, as I will show you later on. How was it all organized? It was highly organized. The aviation provided the information to enhance that perhaps a little more. To photo units, to division intelligence units, to the topographic survey, and of course back to the artillery intelligence and back to the front. Back to the infantry brigade intelligence, and from there the air photos were relayed back to the front. All of that on a very frequent and very highly organized basis. This is getting a little too fast. Now, I want to stress one aspect of the photography during the war that is very important for its use after the war. And that is not the use along, you know, the front lines, but how the photo interpreters started to use and compose air photo mosaics to map the hinterland behind the front for intelligence gathering purposes. And it is because of the French initiative. French planners, architects, and geographers were actually drafted into the French reconnaissance service as interpreters of these photos. And they did a very smart thing. They said, if you want to know about how the Germans plan their attacks and so forth, you have to learn something about German military doctrine and how they deploy their different military assets. And you can see that in the landscape. You can see that how the railheads, you know, come with a lot of material, how trains come in with troops and so forth. And they promoted the use of air photo mosaics to find out what the Germans were up to far behind the front lines. There is an interesting evidence in that you can see how far behind the actual Western front here in Flanders and so forth, reached across the frontier and deeply into the German-held territory. This is a map of the location of World War I air photos as they are still available in Australian, English, Belgian, and American archives, and in German archives as well. And as you can see from the legend here, some of the reddish squares here had as many as 5,000 air photos per unit area. That's how frequently the photography was used by all parties within the war. The aerial reconnaissance headquarters was located for the Allies in Tours, and you can see from this photo that it was not a mom-and-pop operation. This collection of aerial photography happened at an industrial scale during the First World War. And after the war, it dropped off. Have a look at the numbers. And these are just the British numbers of air photo production between 1915 and 1918. It started out extremely modest. In 2015, there were a mere 80,000 air photos, and by the time the war was over in 1818, close to 6 million photos were produced. Those were prints that were made and then distributed to the fronts, to the artillery, to the intelligence, to the mappers, and so forth. I want to contrast that, or compare that, with how vertical aerial photography over Canada since the 1920s evolved. And I've just taken the year, starting with the year 1919. Again, it started out with a very unusual but interesting survey in Labrador for forestry purposes, which wasn't Canada technically then. But in the first 5 years, between 1919 and 24, only a couple of thousand of photographs were collected. And if you look at the present holdings of the National Air Photo Library, we are approaching 6 million, the same number of photos that were produced in print during the last year of the First World War. This statistic after the First World War about the Canadian holdings brings me now to our Canadian situation via the United States. One of the great accomplishments after the war was the construction of a very new camera that used roll film instead of glass plates to collect not just a dozen photos, but 100 photos per roll. And this camera here was developed by Sherman Fairchild, and it was a beautiful piece. I mean, it was sort of the Apple I camera of its day, really. And Fairchild, who was a very good businessman on top of being a good aerial photographer, immediately used the camera to provide this very, very nice mosaic of Manhattan. He collected 100 air photos, stitched them together, and it was all over the place. This was done in 1921, actually, a couple of months after the Halifax survey was done. In Canada itself, aeronautics and the aerial gaze gained some prominence right after the war, if not during the war, by the war artists. Here's an example of Francis Johnston's rendition of Beamsville. Beamsville was a training airport on Lake Ontario, and Johnston went up with the airplanes and rendered this sense of how these fighters trained in their Curtis Jenny biplanes. And I tried to locate this scene, and I was very, very surprised how close he actually rendered the scene, which makes me think that he actually used a little camera to snap this scene while he was up in the cockpit as an observer, because he certainly wasn't up there with his sketch blocks, let alone his canvas. But that was how, for the public, the war effort was portrayed by artists, and the aeriality, as it was called, was entering the picture for sure. I now come to the second convergence that I think is very important for aerial photography, the emergence of aerial photography in Canada. And that involves the creation of the Canada Air Board by the federal government by an act of parliament in the early 1920s. The Air Board was created because the peace treaty of Paris in 1919 stipulated that all the countries are to institute similar air boards to regulate the air traffic, to regulate licensing of pilots, to regulate the airplane safety, and introduce the use of aerial photography for surveying, taking the experience gained through the First World War as a guide. Now, in Canada, the Air Board proceeded with the establishment of 6 different air stations, as they were called. 4 of them were seaplane based, and 3 of them were seaplane based, and the other 3 were on regular landing strips. But this Air Board would not have been effective without a second component. And that second component, that convergence, consisted in what's called the aerial gift. And the Brits were swimming in equipment after the war that they had no use of. Airplanes, air photo equipment, and so forth. So they proceeded to gift that to the colonies. The Canadians got a whole whack, 130 planes, including hangars, including trucks, including air photo laboratories, equipment, and so forth. And the Air Board made ready use of that. The Australians also got a batch, but they didn't quite use it as effectively as the Canadians did. There was also a portion that went to India and to South Africa, but none of these countries made as effective use of that equipment for surveying the vast lands. And it was this vastness of the country that really served as a motivation for the Air Board to do its job. So the planes were all dispatched to the various air stations, including the air photo equipment, and they were tasked in the very early days to take photographs not of far-flung places, but of the cities, because they had good maps for the cities, and they wanted immediately a comparison of how good the photography was. The idea here was that the surveyors, who had a very good idea of where things were across the country, but they didn't have a very good idea of what things were that they mapped. And it was that void that the aerial photography was supposed to fill. Contextual information, thematic information, interpreted from the air photos. The question for the air surveyors, for the surveyors, the traditional surveyors, was, but is the photography exact enough? You know, does it meet our high standards of mapping? So that was the intent of the very early effort, and it was an effort, as the French called it, during the First World War, and then here in Canada, the vue d'ensemble, the overview, to have it covered from coast to coast. The very first survey was done in 1920 over Ottawa. And for the longest time, it was kept under wraps because the air photo mosaic didn't match with the map. Big disappointment. As it turned out, 2 or 3 years later, it was the map that was wrong. But this gives you an idea of the quality of the photography that was collected at the time. You can see this is 1920 because the Peace Tower in the center block has not been built yet. There are other cities that were covered by aerial photography in those early days. I made a mosaic of the photography from London, Ontario, another one from Calgary. There is an existing one from Edmonton. They are wonderful, wonderful resources for early aerial photography of our country. And to give you an idea of the detail that this photography had, I pulled out what I found quite iconic pieces, these rail yards with the roundhouses. They pop out. And so I took them to show you the Ottawa photography, the Halifax photography, and the London photography of those rail yards. And you can see by these comparisons, the Halifax survey was pretty darn sharp and high quality. The London Rail House is the only one that has survived. It has been converted into a public space just last year, and it was opened, I think, in September. So to give you an idea of how these iconic buildings have either not survived or survived in this case. If you take all the efforts from the various stations and the collections of the air photos, you end up with about 5,000 photos that cover these major cities there. The population that lives in these cities that are covered by the photography is about 6.5 million. So every 5th Canadian actually could have access to his first set of photographs of his or her hometown, whether it's Halifax, whether it's Vancouver, or Ottawa, by going back into the archives. Here, and now I come to the example in Halifax. Here, the air station was located at Baker's Point over in Dartmouth, just where the refinery is right now. And to this day, there is sort of a hangar-like, very sizable building that resembles a hangar. At the time, this here was the hangar and the ram from which the seaplanes were lowered into the water. These seaplanes were actually very, very useful. They were also called the flying canoes because they could land on any water surface. Landing strips at the time not being as ubiquitous as they are now. So in this case, this Curtiss flying boat was one of 4 boats that were left by the Americans here. The Americans were the first ones to establish the station in 1818 to patrol the coast for German U-boats. They had another station up in Sydney where they patrolled the entrance to the Gulf of St. Lawrence. And it was to one of these seaplanes that a camera, the K1 camera, was installed to take the survey of Halifax. I want to emphasize that it was again the war artist who captured this activity over the ocean and in the near coastal areas. In this case, it was Arthur Lismer who painted minesweepers and seaplanes in 1919. Lismer was the director of NESCAN at the time, or what is now NESCAN. But now setting the sights on Halifax, this is an oblique view of the peninsula with the flight lines superimposed. They were very rigorous in the sense that they only covered the built-up area of the city. It would have been so easy to cover the entire peninsula, but they were fairly strict. They were probably under order, being soldiers, to just cover the built-up area, and that's what they did. I found this index map of the early air surveys over Halifax, and the air photo mission of 21 is only very faintly covered here, and the yellow markers indicate the location of the photos. It didn't really take long to capture that. You see, the seaplane maybe took another 15 or 20 minutes to reach its ceiling height, and for each of these flight lines, it didn't take more than 1.5 or 2 minutes to cover that, to then turn around, line up with the next line. So the whole survey itself didn't take longer than an hour and a half at tops. And of course, it helped that Baker's Point was very, very close by, so you didn't have much to transit. The map also indicated that the negatives of the surveys were destroyed in 1934, I believe, and the prints are the only pieces that we have left of it. The prints were partially digitized by the National Air Photo Library. I got the first batch, and I was curious if there might be more, and I've had the second batch digitized to then produce in a digital fashion this air photo mosaic of the entire survey, which comprises of 61 photos. I've only used 58 because 3 of them were here over the harbor and just showed water, so I didn't include them. They are located at the Air Photo Library in Ottawa. The date of the acquisition is late winter, early spring of 1921. There are still snow patches and ice patches present. The mosaic itself is about 160 centimeters by 80 centimeters, and in order to reference the individual photos, I used a high altitude photo of the 1960s and the grid pattern of the streets to register the air photos of 1921 against. And I produced a legend, if you will, in a similar fashion as it might have been done in the 1920s, using an interpretation for various types of housing, for various transportation networks, military installations, and so forth. Each photo is about 600 meters across and about 900 meters in dimension. I have prepared a number of detailed sections here that I think will illustrate to you the value that this photography and the mosaic itself has today. And I want you to consider in the following the scientific value, the education value, the historic and the heritage value of these photographs, because they will cover all of these aspects, I think, quite handily. Here's a full photo of the downtown area. That's the complete dimension with the annotation here, K2 for the mission, photo number 2, 1920-21. And the detail is quite remarkable. It's the detail of spy satellite photographs today. So you can see vehicles, you can see even people, but people only as a very, very small dot. And this is, of course, how it looks today. That was a satellite image taken in 2014 when the new convention center was still a big hole in the ground. I want to guide your attention to this area now, where I've tried to sort of test the backward compatibility of the photography by comparing it to the Hopkins City Atlas of 1878. And I've overlaid digitally the aerial photography and the map, and you can see that there is a very, very good match between the map and these still existing buildings, with the exception of a couple here where I'm not quite sure whether the buildings were destroyed and erected again. But there was certainly a difference there where the surveyor either may have made a slight mistake or where change can be detected. I want to take you now to the other end of that flight line, to the south end, where the new railroad station was just inaugurated and where the new ocean pier had just been installed using the excavation from the railroad track that created the new station here. To give you an idea of the detail and the activity that can be seen on these photographs, here's a four-masted bark that is just transferring its cargo to a waiting train with its boxcars, and you can see there's quite a bit of a breeze on that day by the steam from the locomotive and the way the shadow is cast from the steam, and you can see that the smoke is blowing almost vertically. So it was a very, very strong wind that was coming from the west, and it had an impact on the pilot of the plane because he tried to steer against that, and as a result, he didn't quite match the flight lines in the survey. But everything was very experimental still at the time. What was not experimental in the streets of Halifax at the time was the electric streetcar system, or Bernies as they were affectionately called. I started to look for these Bernies on the photographs, and they are quite noticeable because they're fairly sizable cars, and on top they have this contraption that connects the car with the overhead electrical system. And all of that you can see on the air photos. Here is an enlargement of one of these Bernies here. And I've started to look for them all over the place, and I found them. And then connected the Bernie location with dotted lines and ended up with this map of the streetcar system in Halifax at the time. But I had to be very careful because I realized you can easily double count these trolleys because the photos were taken in roughly 8 seconds overlap and time lapse. And during the 8 seconds, the car obviously moved. And in this case, this Bernie here, from photo 2 to photo 3 to photo 4, moved forward, first coming up Duke Street, onto Brunswick Street, past the old garrison here, and then turning up the hill. So this Bernie was only counted once, but it appeared 3 times in the survey itself. I compared the map with the actual Bernie map, and you can see there's a pretty good match. footpaths on Citadel Hill were another thing that impressed me, because many people were on foot as opposed to today. And the system of footpaths is actually quite a spider web that is engarnering the Citadel. If you compare that to the situation today, there are only very few footpaths and lots of parking lots. In this neighborhood, very, very few parking spaces, although there would have been lots of them at the time. The Victoria General Hospital, the first one, is in the top right corner. In the center top was the old Grace Maternity Hospital. In 1921, it wasn't even opened yet. That was still under construction. The old St. Cathedral, built in 1906, I believe. Compare that to the situation today, it's an interesting situation in the North End, I found, because the substance of the buildings is still pretty much preserved. And if you look at the situation at North Street and Agricola Street here in a little more detail, you have the Victorian houses, flat roofs, back alleys, the fence lines, the little gardens in the back, newly constructed sidewalks built with infrastructure money that came from the federal government during the war, and an interesting thing that I found very frequently, these white streaks all over the place. And it took me a little while to clue in what they were. Any idea?
Clotheslines.
Clotheslines, yes. And I could find them all over the place. So I started to map them out as well. And this is the situation of, conservatively estimated clothesline locations in Halifax during that survey. There were about 300 of them. And they provided me with a very interesting and important clue for the data acquisition as well. Because in the old days, what was the wash day? Monday. So I said, this could very well have been a Monday, or it must have been a Monday. So I went back to the Environment Canada meteorological records for that period, where we had, a very good day for flying, and where we still had frozen temperatures and snow and so forth. And I had 3 windows where it could have occurred. My favorite one was this one here. And when I realized that the 21st was a Monday, 13 degrees with some snow still on the ground and temperatures in the minuses before, I think the date of data acquisition was Monday, the 21st of March, 1921. Another street view from an artistic perspective in Lauren Harris's Elevator Court. The famous painting is in the Ontario Art Gallery, but the location of it does no longer exist. It's on what's now Barrington Street, and this entire row of buildings is completely gone by now. But you can exactly position the artist's location from where he sketched the scene. It matches 100% the building heights, roof lines, and so forth. And the big giveaway, of course, is the very large smokestack, and of which you see the shadow over here. That gave it away pretty quickly. And my colleague Ellen Ruffman and the Nova Scotia archivist Gary Schutler also were interested to find another painting of the group of seven painter Lauren Harris that is in the National Gallery, Black Court. And Black Court, I had assumed may have been in Africville, but as it turned out, it was not. And Black Court has nothing to do with the color of one's skin, but it is a family name. It was the name of William Black, who owned this patch of land here, and he developed the land and built these buildings, whether it was him or somebody else. But the location was then known as Black Court. And we're pretty sure that it is right here that Lauren Harris has painted this scene. Now, a very, very important date in the history of Halifax is December the 6th of 1917, the explosion in Halifax Harbour. And I was trying to see evidence of that event in the 1921 photography. And of course, the area of the first flight line covers the Richmond area, and the location of the explosion being very, very close by. There was obviously quite a bit of reconstruction in the 3.5 years after the explosion, but there was still a lot of evidence still on the hill with the foundations that were filled still with snow from the early March snowfall here, where you could see some houses that were rebuilt, other foundations were still not rebuilt. I want to draw your attention here to this row because I've compared it with the insurance maps that were done in mid-1910s. And they were a very, very good guide as to where the buildings were located. And you can see it's a very, very good match between the photography and the pre-existing maps. On the other hand, in terms of post-disaster recovery, the photography still shows in 1921 all the buildings that were erected by the Halifax Relief Commission after the explosion, and you can also see, all the clotheslines that were done up between those buildings. Today, that's covered by the Citadel High School, and the buildings here, the larger ones, those were in the area close to the old CBC building where summer concerts are being held these days. As a last example, I want to show you an interesting comparison with the old photography of 21 and the first really good survey of Halifax that was done by William DeBars in 1777. The map was called Harbour of Halifax, and it was part of the Atlantic Neptune. So I've used a similar approach to digitally overlay the DeBars map to the air photo mosaic, and then see how things match up. And I want to stop it here and indicate to you how very exact the coastline matches. There was another interesting incident that I want to show to you. Here's Windsor Street. Windsor Street was also called the Old Windsor Road. It's one of the oldest streets in Halifax. Now, today it intersects and ends at Quinpool Road, at the Willow Tree. But if you, and that is, this is Quinpool, this is Windsor Street, but if you look here, there is an extension. That's the extension of the old Windsor Road on the DeBar's map. And if you go a step further and, overlay or trace out the streets as mapped by DeBar's and the system of streams with freshwater brook being here in the center, you end up with this little sketch map, from which I now pull out the DeBar's map to see how it matches with the photography. And the match is very, very darn good. So DeBar's was a master of his trade in his days. And you can see that the old Windsor Road extension now leads right through the cemetery. This yellow box indicates one of my last scenes, the forward and backward compatibility of the aerial photography from 1921. And I want to make the point that this aerial photography is, I think, a very important geospatial link between the cartography of the past of Halifax and the very, very modern cartography or image acquisitions by the satellites of our day. Consider the Halifax Dockyard building over here, still very, very noticeable in the 1921 photography. And even to this day, there is this angled jetty here, this one, that harks back at the configuration of the dockyard in those early days. So I want to come to a conclusion and outline what I think is the significance of the aerial photography in those early days as it exists for other Canadian cities, whether it's Ottawa, whether it's London, whether it's Vancouver, Calgary, Hamilton, and Edmonton. We are having here one of the oldest sets of systematic urban aerial photography in Canada. It's an example of modernity and the geospatial technology, really, as it emerged in Canada, stipulated by the Canada Air Board in the 1920s. And as such, it's quite a unique time capsule of the city's urban plan as it existed in the early 1920s. And I think you have gotten a sense how the mosaic and the individual photos retain very relevant information for present-day studies, especially since the detail of it matches quite nicely modern photography from space. And it ought to be part of our heritage and available in the public domain, and it's for that reason that it's within the Dalhousie Library now, the individual photos and the mosaic. And I'm very, very happy to hand it over to the Nova Scotia Archives or to the Municipal Archives of Halifax as well. And that concludes my talk, and I want to thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Dirk. You have a link you'd like to share?
Yeah, that's the it's a link to one of the publications.
I think we might have time for one or two questions if there are questions the audience. We've got one in the back there.
Hi, thank you very much. It was really interesting. Wondering what information you have about the use of this photo technology after 1921, and at what point it became privatized in this area. I know that we have evidence of commercial aerial photography as early as 30s or so here in Nova Scotia, and what the relationship was between this governmental funded survey, aerial survey, and the development of practice.
It really is a parallel stream of government enterprise and private enterprise. Even in the very, very early days, as I pointed out, the 1919 survey of Southern Labrador for assessing the forest resources there was completely funded by private enterprise in the US. Whereas I think pretty much throughout the last century, the acquisition of aerial photography for making topographic maps of the country was always an enterprise that had predominantly a public component, in that either the federal government or provincial governments stipulated surveys at certain intervals. It doesn't mean that they used government or Air Force planes for that. It was farmed out to private enterprise. And private enterprise took the ball, ran with it, not just nationally, but internationally as well. During the 1950s and 60s, Canada's export in air survey technology to other countries was actually quite a brisk business. And in a way, it goes through to the current day. Much of the satellite data acquisition is financed from the public purse, whether it's for image intelligence on the military side, or whether it's for acquiring imagery over Halifax for the municipal side. It's really a two-track system, and it's also a two-track system between the military and the public domain. It goes right through this technology development and its use.
I think, well, maybe one more question. I don't want to take too long.
I came mainly to see photographs of Dartmouth.
Dartmouth only entered the picture in 1931, as far as aerial photography is concerned. In the 1920s, there was no other aerial photography in our area that would cover Dartmouth. And the archives and online archives of the National Air Photo Library actually have the Dartmouth imagery. It's maybe half a dozen or so that cover the Dartmouth area. The scale was less than this. It was 1 to 20,000, I believe. This was all 1 to 5,000 scale. So less detailed, but yes, it's covered, and it's covered from the 1930s onward.
I have a small token of appreciation for giving this talk and sharing the research.
Thank you.
Can we give Dirk one more round? Like I said, this is the penultimate information management lecture of the year. The final one will be on the morning of March the 6th. And we are going to try to get a video of today's lecture up on our website within the next few days. So if there's stuff you missed, or you'd like to check in again, just have a look at our website. It should be up there. Okay? Thank you for attending.
Thanks for coming.